The Sunday morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Church, painting the wooden pews in shades of crimson and gold. Each ray of light seemed deliberately placed, illuminating the faces of the faithful gathered in their Sunday finest, their expensive clothes and satisfied expressions. Pastor Vincent stood at the pulpit, 6 feet above the congregation, his voice booming with practiced authority as he preached about charity and the love of neighbors. Every word was measured, every pause calculated for maximum impact, every gesture designed to move hearts and open wallets. His tailored suit gleamed under the spotlights, the fabric so fine it whispered with each movement, speaking of success, before he uttered a single word. His silver watch caught the sun's rays with every gesture, flashing like a beacon, a subtle reminder that God's favor came with material rewards for those righteous enough to receive them. The congregation of nearly 300 souls nodded in unison, their faces serene and satisfied, their hands clutching leather-bound Bibles that smelled of expensive binding and fresh pages. They were the cream of society, the winners of life's lottery. Doctors and lawyers filled the first 3 rows as they always did. Business owners and real estate developers occupied the middle sections, their presence a testament to respectability. Investment bankers and local politicians sat strategically near the back, always ready for a quick exit after the service ended, always mindful of time and efficiency. Their clothes spoke of country clubs and vacation homes in exotic locations. Their cars in the parking lot were German engineering and Italian design, each one worth more than most families earned in 5 years of honest labor. They came to St. Margaret's not merely for salvation, but for something more immediate, more comfortable. They came for affirmation, for the deep satisfaction of knowing they were on the right side of both God and fortune. They came to hear that their wealth was evidence of divine favor, that their success proved their righteousness, that they deserved everything they had accumulated because they were good people who made good choices and worked hard. Vincent gave them exactly what they craved, week after week, year after year, feeding their egos disguised as feeding their souls. But on this particular Sunday morning, not one of them noticed the man slipping through the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary, doors that weighed hundreds of pounds each and creaked, despite their expensive hinges and regular maintenance. A man whose torn jacket hung on his skeletal frame like rags on a scarecrow, smelling of rain and desperation, and years of sleeping in doorways and under bridges where the wind cut through every layer. A man whose fingernails were black with grime packed so deep that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove it, dirt that had become part of him. A man whose hair hung in matted ropes around a face carved by hardship and hunger and weather, a face that looked decades older than his actual years. A man whose bare feet, swollen and bleeding, left wet prints on the pristine marble floor that custodians spent hours each week polishing to mirror perfection. A man whose presence would turn that perfect morning into ashes, would shatter every comfortable assumption these people held, would expose the rot beneath the golden surface of their faith. Vincent had built his reputation over 15 long years, brick by careful brick, sermon by polished sermon, handshake by strategic handshake. The community knew him as a pillar of righteousness, a man who could quote scripture with the precision of a biblical scholar and deliver sermons that left people weeping in the aisles and reaching for their checkbooks with trembling hands. He knew exactly when to lower his voice to a whisper that made people lean forward in their pews, straining to hear, and when to raise it to thunder that shook the rafters and rattled windows. He knew how to time his pauses for maximum dramatic effect, how to let silence do the heavy work of conviction. His gestures were carefully choreographed, his facial expressions rehearsed in front of mirrors until they looked completely spontaneous and moved by the Holy Spirit. His church had grown from a modest chapel with peeling paint and 20 metal folding chairs and a leaky roof to a towering structure with marble floors imported at tremendous expense from quarries in Italy and crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light, each one costing more than average families earned in an entire year. The transformation had taken a decade of relentless work, of networking at the right dinner parties, and cultivating strategic friendships with wealthy donors, of knowing exactly what people with money wanted to hear and giving it to them in perfectly packaged spiritual wisdom. Donations poured in like rivers after spring storms, Thousands became tens of thousands, became hundreds of thousands, became millions, that built not just a church, but an empire of influence. The wealthy loved him because he never made them too uncomfortable, never truly challenged their lifestyles beyond token gestures that cost them nothing real. The powerful praised him because he knew when to speak prophetically and when to stay strategically silent about their affairs and mistresses, their tax evasion schemes, their cruel business practices that destroyed lives in pursuit of profit. And Vincent, somewhere along the long journey between that modest chapel and this cathedral of marble and gold, between second-hand suits and Italian tailoring, had forgotten what it meant to kneel before anything real. He had convinced himself that his success was proof of God's approval, that his accumulation of wealth was evidence of divine favor rather than skilled human manipulation. He had become a monument to himself, draped in scripture like an expensive costume he wore only for Sunday performances. That particular morning, he was in the middle of reciting from the book of Matthew, chapter 25, his voice rising and falling like ocean waves, each word riding the perfect rhythm he'd spent years perfecting through countless practice sessions. For I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me. The words rolled off his tongue smooth as honey poured from a jar on a warm summer day, and the congregation murmured their approval in that soft collective hum that Vincent had come to crave like an addict craves their drug of choice. It meant they were with him, following his lead. It meant he was winning another Sunday, securing another week of generous donations and community respect. But then a sound cut through the holy silence, like a knife through silk, like a scream in a library, like nails on a chalkboard, the scrape of a bare foot against polished marble, a sound so completely out of place in that carefully orchestrated service that several heads turned immediately, necks craning to identify the source of disruption. The rustle of dirty fabric, heavy and wet from last night's rain. The labored breathing of someone who had walked a long distance with lungs that barely functioned, that wheezed and rattled with every painful inhalation. Vincent's eyes flicked toward the back of the church with practiced subtlety, and what he saw made his jaw visibly tighten, made his carefully crafted pastoral expression crack just slightly around the edges. The homeless man stood uncertainly near the last pew, his shoulders hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight that threatened to crush him into the ground at any moment. His face was almost completely hidden beneath a wild mess of grey hair that hung past his shoulders, matted into thick ropes that hadn't seen shampoo or even clean water in months, maybe years. His beard was equally unkempt, a tangle of grey and black that obscured most of his features, except for those eyes, those haunting eyes. His clothes were layers upon layers of rags, things that might have once been a jacket, a shirt, a sweater, but were now just scraps of fabric holding together through habit more than any remaining structure. Stained with dirt and old food and dried blood, and worse things nobody wanted to identify. Torn in multiple places that revealed weathered skin underneath, skin that was grey and scarred and covered in sores. His bare feet, swollen and infected, left dark wet prints on the immaculate floor. He clutched a torn plastic grocery bag in one trembling hand, probably containing everything he owned in the world. The smell reached the first few rows within seconds, carried efficiently by the church's expensive heating system, the sharp tang of accumulated sweat, the acrid smell of urine, the sweet decay of unwashed flesh. A woman in the third row, Eleanor Montgomery, wife of a prominent surgeon, covered her nose with an embroidered handkerchief, her face contorting in obvious disgust. Her husband Thomas pulled his expensive jacket protectively closer, as if the smell might somehow contaminate the fabric and ruin it forever. Vincent stopped mid-sentence, the words about welcoming strangers dying on his lips. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate, sharp enough to draw blood. You could hear the heating system humming. You could hear nervous breathing. You could hear the collective tension of 300 people waiting to see what their leader would do, how he would handle this disruption, this contamination of their sacred space. He stared at the intruder, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to irritation to something much colder, something that looked dangerously close to contempt. The homeless man shuffled forward slowly, his bare feet making wet sounds against the marble that echoed obscenely in the silence. His eyes searched the room desperately, as if looking for something he'd lost long ago, something precious that might be hiding in the faces of these clean, comfortable people who smelled like soap and success. He moved with obvious pain, each step a visible battle against exhaustion and malnutrition, and whatever diseases were slowly consuming him from the inside. And when he finally reached the middle aisle, when he stood in that exact spot where brides walked toward their futures and coffins were wheeled toward hearses, he looked up at Vincent with eyes that carried unimaginable weight, eyes that were bloodshot and tired, but somehow still held a spark of desperate hope. "Brother," the homeless man said, his voice cracked and dry like old leather left too long in desert sun. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort, seemed to scrape painfully against his throat. "I'm hungry, please. Just a little bread. Anything at all. I haven't eaten in 3 days. I just need something. Anything you can spare." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, visible and present and impossible to ignore. A request so simple it was almost childlike. Bread. Not money, not a full meal at an expensive restaurant, just bread. The most basic food in human history. The thing Jesus called himself. Vincent's face hardened instantly, transforming from gentle shepherd to something far less charitable. His eyes narrowed into sharp slits. His jaw set like concrete. His hands gripped the pulpit edges so hard his knuckles turned bone white, so hard the wood creaked audibly under the pressure. He descended from the elevated platform, where he'd just been preaching about feeding the hungry, each step deliberate and measured, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with sharp rhythm that sounded like a countdown to judgment. The congregation watched in perfect silence, some people leaning forward with expressions of curiosity, others pulling back with expressions of fear or disgust. Vincent stopped just a few feet from the homeless man, close enough to experience the full assault of his smell, close enough to see every detail of his degradation. "This is a house of God," Vincent said, his voice low but cutting like a blade, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to convey absolute authority and absolute contempt. Not a homeless shelter, not a soup kitchen, not a place for people like you to wander in off the street. You don't belong here. You're disrupting our worship service. You're disturbing these good people who came here to connect with God. People who showed up clean and proper and respectful. The homeless man blinked slowly, confusion and deep hurt crossing his weathered face like storm clouds. "But you were just saying," he gestured weakly toward the pulpit with one trembling hand, "about feeding the hungry, welcoming strangers, about helping people who—" "I was speaking to my congregation," Vincent interrupted sharply, his voice rising now, his carefully maintained pastoral tone cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "To people who contribute financially to this church, people who support our mission with their tithes and offerings, people who respect this sacred place and dress appropriately and don't smell like sewage, not beggars who wander in expecting handouts because they're too lazy to work for a living." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd like a wave. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces showing the first small cracks of doubt. But nobody spoke up. Nobody challenged him. Nobody stood and said this was wrong. The homeless man's face fell, crumbling like old paper, and he took a small step backward, his bare feet sliding slightly in his own wet footprints. "I didn't mean any harm, brother. I just heard your voice from outside, heard you talking about Jesus and helping people, and I thought maybe—" "Don't call me brother," Vincent snapped, his face flushing red now, his composure completely gone. "And don't think you can stand here guilting us with your problems. We worked hard for what we have. We earned it through discipline and dedication. What have you done except make poor choices and expect the world to rescue you?" He turned sharply toward the deacon sitting near the front. "Marcus, James, escort this man out immediately. Get him out of my church, and make sure he doesn't come back." 2 large men in dark suits rose instantly. They moved toward the homeless man with cold efficiency. Marcus, the larger one, grabbed his arm roughly, his thick fingers digging into the thin limb hard enough to leave bruises. James took the other arm with equal force. "Please," the homeless man said quietly, his voice breaking, tears beginning to stream down his dirty face, cutting clean tracks through the grime. "I'll leave peacefully, I promise. I thought God's house was for everyone, for broken people like me too." But Marcus jerked his arm violently, making him stumble. They began dragging him toward the exit, his bare feet scraping against the marble, leaving smears of blood. The homeless man didn't resist, didn't fight back. He let them pull him along like garbage being removed. The congregation watched in heavy silence. Some faces showed approval, relief that order was being restored. Others looked away, suddenly fascinated by their Bibles or shoes. A few people, just a few, had tears in their eyes, hands pressed to mouths, expressions suggesting something inside them was breaking. Vincent returned to the pulpit, breathing slightly heavy, and smoothed down his expensive jacket. "Now," he said with forced brightness that sounded hollow, "let us continue. Where was I? Ah, yes, the love of God, and our duty to show charity to those in need." But before he could say another word, the homeless man stopped at the door. He planted his bleeding feet, found some reserve of strength, and turned back. He looked directly at Vincent, and the entire church seemed to hold its breath. "You know," the homeless man said, his voice stronger now despite the tears, carrying across the entire sanctuary with perfect clarity. "I once knew a pastor who preached exactly the same words you just did. He had a beautiful church just like this one, with expensive decorations and comfortable pews. He wore expensive suits just like yours, and had a congregation that hung on his every word. He talked about love and charity and helping the poor with the same conviction you have. But when his own son became lost, when his boy ended up on the streets with nothing but rags on his back, that pastor didn't recognize him. He walked right past him on the sidewalk multiple times without seeing him, because he'd trained himself not to see people like that. And once, just once, when the son begged him directly for help, that pastor threw money at him like throwing scraps to a dog, never looking at his face. Because if he'd looked, really looked, he would have had to acknowledge what he'd become." The silence became suffocating. Vincent's smile vanished completely. His face began draining of color. The congregation looked between the two men with growing confusion. "That pastor's name," the homeless man continued, his voice trembling but determined, "was Richard Mallory. He was my father, and my name is Samuel Mallory." The words landed like a bomb. Vincent's face went completely ashen. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The congregation erupted into chaos. Whispers became shouts. People jumped to their feet. An elderly woman in the front row gasped loudly and stood, her body shaking. "Samuel?" she whispered, then louder. "Samuel, is that really you?" The homeless man turned to her, tears flowing freely now. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson. It's been 23 years. You taught me in Sunday school. You said I had a beautiful voice." The church exploded with noise. Vincent stumbled backward, gripping the pulpit desperately. "No," he whispered, "that's impossible." "Dead?" Samuel finished. "Is that what you told them? That your son died? Or did you just stop mentioning me, pretended I never existed?" Mrs. Patterson rushed down the aisle and took his hands without hesitation. "Oh, my dear boy," she sobbed. "What happened to you? We looked everywhere. We prayed every day." Samuel looked at her gently. "Life happened, Mrs. Patterson. I made terrible choices. I fell into drugs at 17. I disappointed my father. I embarrassed him. I wasn't the perfect pastor's son his reputation required, and when I needed help most, when I came begging, he told me I was dead to him." Vincent found his voice. "You left," he shouted. "You threw away everything, the education, the opportunities, the future I built." Samuel nodded slowly. "I did. I made terrible choices. But do you know what I needed most during those years, Dad?" The word hit like a physical blow. "I needed my father. I needed someone to tell me I was still worth something. But every time I came to you, you turned me away. You said I was an embarrassment, so I stopped coming." Marcus and James released Samuel and stepped back, their faces pale. Half the congregation began leaving, unable to witness more. Vincent's perfect image crumbled like sand. Mrs. Patterson turned to Vincent, her voice shaking with fury. "Is this true? Is this your son?" Vincent's shoulders sagged. "Yes," he whispered. "He's my son." More families left. Those remaining stared at their fallen leader. Samuel stepped forward. "I didn't come to destroy you, Dad. I came because I'm dying. End-stage liver disease. 6 months, maybe less. And before I go, I needed to see if anything remained of the father I once knew." Vincent collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "Samuel, I'm sorry, so sorry." Samuel knelt beside him. "I forgive you. But understand something. This church, this building, it's not your legacy. How you treat the broken, the lost, that's your legacy. And today you failed." Mrs. Patterson pulled Samuel up. "You're coming with me. Hospital, then my guest room." Samuel smiled. "Yes, ma'am." At the door, Samuel paused. "I hope you find your way back, Dad, because the God I remember doesn't live in buildings. He lives in hearts that love without condition. And right now, I'm not sure where your heart is." The door closed. Vincent remained alone, kneeling in his beautiful church as the remaining people left. The stained glass no longer glowed. The silence was deafening. For hours he stayed there, staring at the cross, praying without performance for the first time in years. News spread like wildfire. Most people couldn't shake the image of Samuel's eyes holding more grace than any sermon. Samuel stayed with Mrs. Patterson, who cared for him with fierce tenderness. She cooked meals, though he could barely eat. She sat through long, painful nights. Others visited, bringing presents and witnessing his humanity beneath the rags. Vincent tried to visit but couldn't find courage. He'd stand outside for 20 minutes before walking away. The church emptied dramatically. Attendance dropped to 35. Donations dried up. 3 months later, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that matched his mood perfectly, Vincent finally found the courage to knock on Mrs. Patterson's door. His hand shook as he raised it. The sound of his knuckles against the wood seemed impossibly loud, echoing in his ears like thunder. He almost ran, almost turned and fled like he had so many times before, but then the door opened and she stood there. This elderly woman who had shown his son more love in 3 months than he'd shown in years. Her face was stern, but not completely unkind, lined deeply with age and grief and determined purpose. "He's been waiting for you," she said simply, without preamble, without making him explain or beg or justify himself. She stepped aside to let him enter, and Vincent walked into her modest home, with its worn but comfortable furniture, family photos covering every available wall space, and the warm smell of soup cooking on the stove, a smell that reminded him of home, of what home should be. He found Samuel in the guest room at the back of the house, propped up carefully by multiple pillows, his body looking impossibly thin now, wasting away rapidly. The hospice nurse had been there that morning and left, shaking her head sadly, saying it wouldn't be much longer, maybe days, certainly not weeks, certainly. Samuel's face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow and sunken, his eyes deep in their sockets, but they were clear and lucid, and somehow still held that spark of something that refused to completely die despite everything. When he saw his father standing uncertainly in the doorway, Samuel smiled, and that smile was like forgiveness made visible, like grace given tangible form. "You came," he said, his voice weak but genuinely happy, genuinely surprised that his father had finally found the courage. Vincent crossed the small room in 3 quick steps and fell to his knees beside the narrow bed, with a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp, his expensive shoes hitting the worn carpet with a heavy thud. He took his son's skeletal hand in both of his own, feeling how fragile it was, how the bones seemed to press through the papery skin like they might break through at any moment, how cold it felt despite the warm room. "I'm sorry I took so long," he said, his voice breaking immediately, splintering into pieces, all his practiced control completely gone, stripped away by grief and shame. "I'm sorry for everything, for all of it, for every moment I failed you, every time I chose wrong, every opportunity I wasted to be the father you deserved. I'm sorry for being such a coward, for choosing my reputation over my own son, for failing you in every single way a father can fail. I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me most. I'm sorry for walking past you on the street like you were invisible. I'm sorry for all the years we lost, all the time we'll never get back. I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm so terribly, deeply sorry." Samuel squeezed his hand weakly, using what little strength remained in his failing body. "I know, Dad," he said softly, his voice carrying no bitterness, no resentment, just acceptance, and something that looked impossibly like peace. "And I meant what I said that day at the church, every single word. I forgive you, completely and totally. I let go of all of it. I released all the anger and hurt and disappointment. I don't have time left for holding grudges or nursing old wounds. Life's too short, and mine is almost over. They talked for hours that afternoon, perhaps the most honest conversation they'd ever had in Samuel's entire 39 years of life. Vincent told Samuel things he'd never told anyone, about his own father, Samuel's grandfather, a harsh fundamentalist preacher who had taught him through fists and belts that weakness was sin, that showing emotion was failure, that success was measured only by what others could see and respect. A man who had systematically beaten the softness out of him as a child, beaten the humanity out of him, replaced it with ambition and appearance and the desperate, gnawing need for external approval. Samuel listened without judgment, finally understanding where his father's cruelty had come from, how wounded people wound others. Samuel told Vincent about his years on the street in detail this time, not sparing anything, not protecting his father from the full horror of what his abandonment had meant, the kindness of strangers who had nothing themselves but shared anyway, who gave their last dollar or their only sandwich without hesitation. The cruelty of those who had everything but couldn't spare even a moment of compassion or a word of acknowledgement. The cold winters, sleeping in doorways with cardboard as his only blanket, waking up with frost in his beard. The hunger that became so constant and familiar, you stopped really feeling it. Your stomach just a hollow ache that never quite went away. The times he almost died from exposure or infection or overdose, and the times he actively wished he would die because living hurt too much. They cried together finally for all the lost years and wasted opportunities. They laughed together at remembered moments from when Samuel was small and the world still held promise, good memories that existed beneath all the pain like gold buried under rock. And somewhere in that small room that smelled of medicine and soup and approaching death, something that had been broken for decades began, impossibly, miraculously, to heal. Vincent came every single day for the next 3 weeks, without fail, without excuse. He would arrive in the early morning before the sun fully rose and stay until evening shadows stretched long across the floor, leaving only when the hospice nurse gently but firmly insisted he needed to go home and rest, needed to take care of himself too. He fed Samuel when his son could no longer feed himself, couldn't hold a spoon or lift a cup, spooning broth and mashed foods into his mouth with infinite patience, wiping his chin gently when food dribbled down. He read to him when the pain medication made it impossible for Samuel to focus his eyes on pages, reading from the Bible, but also from the poetry Samuel had always loved, from Whitman's Leaves of Grass and Frost's collected works, and verses Samuel had memorized as a boy. He sang hymns in a voice that was rusty from years of performance and pretense, now raw with genuine emotion, with real feeling, with the kind of worship that comes from a heart breaking open. And when Samuel's breathing became increasingly labored, when each breath was clearly a struggle, when the end was obviously very near, and the hospice nurse said it would be tonight or tomorrow at the latest, Vincent made a decision. He carefully climbed into the narrow bed beside his son, mindful of the IV lines running into his arms and the fragile body that seemed made of glass and paper, and he wrapped his arms around this dying man who had once been his little boy, afraid of thunderstorms. He held him the way he hadn't since Samuel was 7 years old and woke from nightmares crying for his father. "I'm proud of you," Vincent whispered into his son's thinning hair, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces, his tears falling onto Samuel's scalp and running down into his ears. "Not for what you achieved or didn't achieve, not for any accomplishments or failures, not for any of that meaningless nonsense I used to think mattered so much. I'm proud of you for surviving, for enduring when most people would have given up, for keeping your humanity when the world tried to strip it away piece by piece. I'm proud of you for teaching me what grace really looks like, for showing me what true forgiveness means, for being a better man than I ever was, even when you had absolutely nothing and I had everything the world says matters. I'm proud to be your father, even though I don't deserve to be, even though I failed so completely at being what you needed. I'm proud of you, Samuel, so incredibly proud." Samuel's eyes fluttered open one final time, consciousness surfacing briefly from the morphine haze that had kept him comfortable, and he looked at his father with perfect clarity, with perfect peace written across his gaunt features. "I love you, Dad," he breathed, the words taking tremendous effort, taking everything he had left, each syllable a gift. "I always loved you, even when I hated you, even when I tried so hard not to care anymore. I always loved you, underneath everything." "I love you too, son," Vincent said, his voice steady for the first time in months, certain and true, and meaning it with every cell in his body, with every beat of his heart. "I love you so much. I'm sorry I didn't know how to show it properly. I'm sorry I forgot how to be a real father. But I love you, Samuel. I love you more than anything." And then, as the rain fell softly and steadily against the window of Mrs. Patterson's guest room, as the afternoon light faded gradually into evening, as Vincent held him and whispered words of love and forgiveness and pride, Samuel took one last shallow breath, barely moving his chest, and was gone, slipping away so quietly and peacefully that for several minutes Vincent didn't fully realize it had happened. He kept talking to him, kept telling him things, kept holding him close until he finally understood that his son was no longer there to hear, that Samuel had left him one final time, but this time it wasn't abandonment. This time it was release. The funeral was held 4 days later, not in St. Margaret's grand cathedral with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but in the tiny chapel where Vincent had first started his ministry 3 decades ago, back when he was young and idealistic and still believed that faith was fundamentally about helping people, rather than impressing them, before ambition had poisoned everything. The building seated maybe 50 people on its worn wooden pews, and it was packed beyond any reasonable capacity, with people standing pressed together in the back and spilling out onto the small lawn outside, needing to be there, needing to witness. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, her face carefully composed but her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. There were others who had known Samuel as a child, neighbors who remembered him playing in their yards, former teachers who recalled his bright mind, people from the community who had heard his story and were deeply moved by it. But there were also others, dozens and dozens of others, homeless men and women from the shelter downtown, where Samuel had stayed during particularly cold winters, people he'd met during his years living on the street, people who existed in tent cities under highway overpasses and slept in doorways and survived on whatever they could find or beg. They stood respectfully in the back rows, wearing whatever clean clothes they could find or borrow, their presence a powerful and moving testament to the life Samuel had actually lived, to the connections he'd made in the margins, to the humanity he'd maintained even at his absolute lowest. Some of them cried openly and without any shame, tears streaming down weathered faces. Others stood in complete silence, their faces showing a grief that was profound and absolutely real, mourning the loss of someone who had treated them like human beings, deserving of dignity. Vincent stood at the simple wooden pulpit, so utterly different from the marble and gold of St. Margaret's, and he spoke without any notes, without any preparation, without any of his old performance techniques or rhetorical flourishes. His voice was quiet, completely raw, stripped of all pretense and polish and careful word choice and strategic pauses for effect. "My son taught me something I should have learned decades ago," he began, his voice steady despite the tears that wouldn't stop falling. "He taught me that real faith, authentic faith, genuine faith isn't found in buildings no matter how grand, isn't found in sermons no matter how polished, isn't found in how many people show up on Sunday morning, or how much money gets donated, or how respected you are in the community, or how many magazine articles get written about your successful ministry. Real faith is found in how we treat those who can't possibly repay us, who have nothing to offer us in return, who make us uncomfortable, who challenge all our assumptions about how the world should work and who deserves what. Faith is found in whether we can see the face of Christ in a complete stranger, in the desperate eyes of someone who smells like the street, in the pleading voice of someone we'd rather ignore, someone we'd rather cross the street to avoid, someone we've been taught to fear or dismiss as lazy or morally deficient." He paused, struggling to continue, his voice breaking repeatedly. "Faith is found in the smallest acts of mercy, shown to the least deserving, because that's what mercy actually means by definition. It means giving what absolutely isn't deserved, loving what isn't naturally lovely, seeing worth and value where society sees none, where society has decided there's nothing worth saving. And I failed that test completely, utterly, in every possible way. I failed it as a pastor who should have known better, and I failed it even more catastrophically as a father who should have loved without condition. I had every advantage, every resource, every opportunity imaginable to show real love, and instead I chose pride every single time. I chose reputation over relationship. I chose comfort over compassion. I chose everything except what actually mattered, what actually lasts beyond our brief time here. His voice grew unexpectedly stronger, filled with an emotion that transcended simple grief or regret. But Samuel, my son, my beautiful broken boy, he passed that test every single day of his difficult life, even when he had absolutely nothing, especially when he had nothing material, even when he was at his absolute lowest and darkest point, when most people would have lost all hope. He maintained his fundamental humanity. He showed kindness to other homeless people when he barely had anything to give. He shared food when he was literally starving. He looked out for others when nobody was looking out for him. He forgave me when I absolutely didn't deserve any forgiveness, when forgiveness should have been completely impossible after everything I'd done. He showed me what real faith looks like, what it costs, what it means. Several people in the congregation were openly weeping now, not just the homeless folks, but the well-dressed neighbors too, everyone united in grief. And I pray with absolutely everything in me, that God in His infinite mercy gives me whatever time I have remaining to learn what my son already knew in his bones, to become even a fraction of the kind of person he was, to live the kind of authentic faith he showed me was actually possible. Because Samuel's faith was real in a way mine never was. It wasn't about buildings or budgets or sermons or appearances or reputation. It was about love, just love. Simple, uncomplicated, freely given love, without strings attached. And that's the only thing that actually matters in the end. That's the only thing that lasts when everything else burns away. That's what we take with us. After the funeral service ended, after Samuel's simple pine casket was lowered slowly into the ground in the paupers section of the municipal cemetery because he'd had no money and no insurance and no assets of any kind, after the last mourner had offered condolences and left, and the cemetery workers had begun filling in the grave with mechanical efficiency, Vincent stood completely alone by the fresh mound of earth. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep red. He stood there for over an hour, just standing, just being present, just trying to accept that his son was really gone. Then he volunteered at the downtown shelter. Staff were skeptical, but he proved himself daily, serving food, washing dishes, learning names and stories, learning to truly see. 6 months later, a bruised young woman approached. "Are you Pastor Vincent?" "I used to be, now just Vincent." She sat. "He brought soup. I heard about your son. People say you finally woke up. They say maybe there's hope if someone like you can change." His throat tightened. "I don't deserve that grace." "That's what makes it grace," she replied. "Nobody deserves it." Later, he looked at Samuel's childhood photo. "I'm trying, son, really trying." Years followed with constant struggle. Pride kept resurfacing, but he'd remember Samuel's forgiving eyes. Mrs. Patterson's words, "Your son's legacy is love, don't waste it." St. Margaret's found Rebecca Torres as pastor. She'd been homeless as a teenager. She opened the church to everyone, turned the basement into a shelter, shifted the budget to service. Some returned, others stayed away. But new people came who looked like Samuel. Vincent attended occasionally, always in back. Rebecca preached the same words, but now they felt true. 2 years after Samuel's death, a teenage boy sat beside Vincent. He smelled like the street. "Is it okay if I sit here?" Vincent smiled, seeing Samuel's face. "Of course, you're exactly where you belong." "I'm homeless. Didn't know where else to go." Vincent saw every failed opportunity for grace, but also a chance to choose differently. "Then you came to the right place," he said with certainty. "After service, I'll make sure you get food and shelter. You're not alone anymore." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Really, I promise, you're not alone." As service continued, Vincent felt peace. Not false peace from admiration, but deep peace from finally understanding what matters. Samuel paid a terrible price for that lesson. But his death wasn't meaningless. Sunlight poured through windows. Vincent saw it differently now, falling on everyone equally, clean and dirty, wealthy and poor, illuminating truth he'd been too blind to see. God's love doesn't live in buildings. It lives between people when one reaches for another. In choosing compassion over judgment, in every mercy shown to the undeserving, Samuel knew that always. Now Vincent was learning it too. Service ended. Vincent stood with the teenager, ready to help. Walking into sunlight, he looked up and whispered his daily prayer. "Thank you, son, for not giving up on me, for showing me truth, for loving me when I didn't deserve it, for forgiving the unforgivable. Thank you, Samuel." Wind carried his words away. Vincent believed Samuel heard them, that his son knew the lesson landed, that death wasn't wasted. In that belief, that hope, that endless grace, Vincent found what he'd searched for all his life: peace, purpose, truth, not in a position or reputation, but in his true self, in service, in real faith. In finally understanding what Samuel tried to show him, he found his way home.